"You cannot mean to wear that muslin, Honora. The candle wax is still fresh on the hem, and the whole room smells of starch and lavender water." Lady Vale did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Her disapproval moved like a pin drawn through silk, neat, cold, and meant to leave no visible tear. Honora stood before the dressing-glass with her gloves folded in her hands, while behind her the maid laced Celia into pale blue satin, and Marianne shook out a fan painted with roses. At 27, Honora had long ceased to mistake such moments for ordinary family conversation. She was not being dressed for the county assembly. She was being arranged for display, like a caution placed at the edge of a pretty picture. "You will stand quietly," her mother went on, fastening a ruby clasp at her own throat. "You will not vanish into corners before anyone has seen you. Your sisters must learn what becomes of a woman who mistakes reserve for virtue and good sense for charm." Celia gave a little laugh and then, seeing Honora's face in the mirror, pretended to cough instead. Marianne looked down at her slippers. They were handsome girls, both of them, all bright bloom and easy expectation. Their gowns whispered when they moved. Honora's did not whisper at all. Dove brown, plain in the candlelight, cut neatly but with no ambition in it. It was the sort of gown a mother chose for a daughter she wished noticed only as far as was useful. Honora bent to pick up Marianne's dropped ribbon before the maid could stoop for it. "You need not be afraid I shall outshine anyone, Mamma," she said. Lady Vale's mouth curved. "No, that at least has never been a danger." The words landed cleanly. They always did. Yet the sting was older than this evening. It had the shape of years. Years of being the eldest, the quietest, the one spoken over when visitors praised eyes, hair, complexion, prospects. Years of hearing that her godmother's legacy, once meant to secure her future, had somehow melted away through poor judgment and inconvenient softness. Lady Vale called it improvidence. Others called it mystery. Only Honora knew how many sacks of meal, how many jars of physic, how many bushels of seed had vanished into cottages where winter had bitten harder than pride could bear. She drew on one glove, then the other, smoothing each finger into place. It was a small, steadying act. When accounts tangled or tempers rose, or her mother sharpened herself for company, she had long ago formed the habit of whispering a phrase under her breath, half prayer, half rebuke to herself. Tonight it came before she could stop it. "A debtor of the parish," she murmured. Lady Vale turned sharply. "What did you say?" "Nothing of consequence." But it was not nothing. The phrase had weight, memory, and a private ache. It belonged to cold church vestries, ink-stained ledgers, damp wool cloaks, and that terrible season people had begun to call the Murren winter. It belonged to nights Honora had spent by candlelight, making columns of grain and medicine agree with sums that left her poorer each time, and strangely easier in her own soul. Her mother had already dismissed the moment. "Come," she said, "the musicians will be tuning by now, and I will not have the Vale girls arrive after the Ashford party." At that name, something faint and uneasy stirred in the room. Even Celia fell still. The Duke of Ashford had been absent from most county pleasures for a year. He was spoken of in lowered voices, as men of great land and little company often were. Some said pride, some said sorrow. Some said he attended this assembly only because his steward had insisted he must be seen among his neighbors at last. Honora took up her shawl and followed the others downstairs, into the hall where the footman waited with lantern and cloak. Outside, the air smelled of wet gravel and horse breath. Somewhere beyond the drive, a carriage wheel struck stone, and in the assembly rooms ahead, under a blaze of wax lights and polished mirrors, the one man in the county who had carried her words in his pocket for a year was already listening for a voice he had never heard. If you enjoy slow-burn stories of quiet women and public reckonings, Do subscribe before we go on. By the time their carriage reached the assembly rooms, the windows were already blazing with candlelight, and the gravel before the entrance glittered with damp, as if the whole drive had been strewn with ground glass. Footmen moved through the mist with flaring lanterns, velvet hems lifted above the wet steps. Somewhere inside, a violin tested a high note, then another answered it. Lady Vale gathered her daughters with one quick look, her gloved fingers light on Celia's elbow, firmer on Marianne's wrist, and barely touching Honora at all. To be guided, after all, was a form of favor. The hall within was warm enough to make the air heavy. Beeswax, perfume, wool cloaks drying by the door, and the faint, sharp scent of evergreen boughs from the stair rail mingled under the chandeliers. Mirrors multiplied the crowd until the rooms seemed full of twice as many ambitious mothers and hopeful daughters as nature had truly provided. Honora paused just long enough to unfasten her cloak, and in that pause she saw what others came to such evenings to measure. Which young lady had arrived first, whose gown had been newly trimmed, which gentleman bowed too low, which widow still wore black with elegance enough to make it look intentional. She also saw, near the far end of the room, the man her mother had named in the carriage with such caution. The Duke of Ashford stood apart from the bright knot of local families, as if some invisible ring had been left around him. He was not old, though gravity had settled in his face more deeply than fashion usually allowed in a man of his years. His coat was cut with perfect simplicity. His cravat was plain. Nothing about him invited attention, and yet attention gathered there all the same. Women glanced, looked away, and then looked back. Men approached him with care. He answered civilly and gave little away. Lady Vale followed her eldest daughter's line of sight and lowered her voice. "You need not stare, Honora. His Grace is not a man for idle speculation." "I was not speculating, Mamma." "No," her mother said, "but other people may." That, too, was warning. Ashford, for his part, had not come to admire pretty shoulders or endure stale card-room talk. The county imagined many things about his withdrawal, and most of them were wrong. The truth was plainer and more inconvenient. For nearly a year he had been trying to discover who had intervened at Briar Hollow, while sickness among the cattle and a failed harvest left his tenants on the edge of ruin. Someone had sent corn before the roads froze solid. Someone had paid for fever powders, lamp oil, and seed to be held back for spring sowing. Someone who understood hunger well enough to know that relief given too late was only ceremony. He had questioned clergymen, stewards, millers, widows who kept parish lists, even a carrier who remembered delivering sealed packets in weather fit for no Christian errand. Again and again, the trail ended in the same hard little phrase entered into relief books in a neat hand, and nowhere else. A debtor of the parish. Tonight he stood beneath a painted ceiling with one folded scrap from those ledgers resting inside his coat, as he had carried it for months, more from habit now than expectation. He had nearly ceased to believe the search would end at all. Then Lady Vale swept her daughters forward into the crush, and Honora, delayed by an elderly matron whose reticule had slipped to the floor, bent to retrieve it. "Your kindness, Miss Vale," the woman said, breathless from the heat. "It is nothing," Honora answered softly. "One does what one can." Ashford's head turned at the sound of her voice, though it was not the voice alone that fixed him in place, but the grave, familiar calm beneath it. He did not cross the room at once. That stillness, in a man like Ashford, meant more than a dramatic exclamation ever could. His fingers closed over the folded paper inside his coat, as if to make certain it was truly there. He had read those few lines so often that the texture of the page had grown familiar to him, softened at the creases, rough at one corner where rain had once touched it before he could put it away. He remembered the first time it had been placed in his hand by the vicar of Briar Hollow, together with a ledger spotted by damp and lamp smoke. No name, no title, only neat figures, careful instructions, and that strange signature at the foot, humble enough to look almost severe. Across the room, Honora had no notion of any of this. She had been reclaimed by her mother and steered, with deceptive gentleness, into the path of two gentlemen who wished to dance with Celia and Marianne. Lady Vale smiled as introductions were made. "My eldest daughter, Miss Vale," she said, with that polished pause which could cut more deeply than a sneer. "She no longer dances the earlier sets. Youth should enjoy its brief season while it may." The younger of the two gentlemen bowed to Honora out of duty, not interest. The older gave her a glance of faint discomfort, the sort people wear when they fear they have been placed too near another person's disappointment. Honora inclined her head and stepped back before either man could offer the courtesy of asking her. She had been trained, over time, to ease everyone else's awkwardness before they were required to feel it. Lady Vale, having made her point, turned her full attention to her prettier daughters. Silk rustled, fans opened with soft snaps. Celia was laughing now, lightly, because she was relieved the humiliating moment had passed from herself to someone safer. Marianne, less certain, looked once toward her sister and then away. Honora moved toward the side of the room where potted orange trees stood beneath the windows. The air there was cooler. Condensation silvered the glass, and beyond it the night lay black over the assembly yard. She could hear the scrape of chairs being shifted for the dancers, the low swell of conversation, the scent of citrus leaves mixed oddly with wax and crowded bodies. If one wished to disappear at a gathering, one learned how to choose one's corner. Ashford watched Lady Vale's little display from afar, and what he saw sharpened his attention rather than distracting it. He had spent the better part of a year searching for an anonymous benefactress who understood both accounts and hunger. He had expected, if he found her, a clergyman's widow, perhaps, a land agent's sister, some practical woman grown invisible by habit. He had not expected to see that same habit of invisibility imposed upon her by her own family in the middle of a fashionable room. Then Mrs. Elling, a stout matron with weak ankles and too much lace at her sleeves, faltered near the orange trees and nearly tipped her glass of ratafia down the front of her gown. Honora caught her arm at once. "Bless me," the lady said, flushed and flustered. "I am forever making trouble for someone." "You are making none," Honora answered. "Sit for a moment. One settles these little accidents best before they become expensive." It was the word "settles," and the quiet firmness with which she said it, that sent a chill of recognition straight through him. Because written in the margin of that old parish book, beside a list of fever draughts and lamp oil, had been one brief note in the same hand. "Settle the apothecary first. Children cannot wait upon quarter day." Ashford lifted his head fully then, his gaze fixed upon the woman in the brown muslin, as the musicians raised their bows for the first strains of the evening. The first notes had scarcely sounded when he began to move. It was not a hurried movement. Ashford crossed the floor with the calm precision of a man who had made up his mind and did not intend to be diverted. That alone was enough to stir attention. A duke walking anywhere in a crowded room created a current. A duke walking with purpose created silence in little pockets as he passed. Honora, still beside Mrs. Elling, did not at first understand that he approached her. She only noticed that conversation thinned and that one or two ladies near the card tables turned their heads too quickly. Lady Vale noticed sooner. Her whole body altered with it. One could almost hear the soft click by which expectation changed its direction. She touched Celia's sleeve, then Marianne's, arranging them with the swiftness of long practice. A mother who had spent years studying rank could read intention in half a glance, and she saw a great man coming toward her daughters. Whatever chill she had lately felt toward Honora vanished beneath a brighter urgency. "Stand straight," she murmured. "Celia, lift your chin. "Marianne, do not fidget, for heaven's sake, girls." Honora heard that tone and understood at once that she herself was to be moved aside. She did it willingly, taking a step back toward the orange trees. It spared her the trouble of being publicly overlooked. Yet Mrs. Elling, poor soul, still clung lightly to her arm and needed settling onto a chair. Honora bent to straighten the older woman's shawl where it had slipped. "You are very good," Mrs. Elling whispered. "I have had practice in small emergencies," Honora said, and the hint of dry humor in her voice was so quiet that only someone very near would have caught it. Ashford did catch it. By then he was close enough to see that her gloves had been neatly mended at the fingertips, and that one curl at her temple had loosened in the heat of the room. He also saw what the rest of the assembly had long been trained not to see: weariness. The settled weariness of a woman too often asked to diminish herself for other people's comfort. Lady Vale stepped into his path with an accomplished smile. "Your Grace, what an honor! My daughters have been hoping." He bowed because politeness required it, though his eyes had already gone past her. "Lady Vale." Celia colored prettily. Marianne dropped a curtsy half a beat too late. Their mother extended the introduction with smooth confidence. "My younger girls, sir. Miss Celia Vale, Miss Marianne Vale." "And Miss Honora Vale," he said. There was the smallest pause after the name. Small things matter in rooms like that. A pause can expose a hierarchy more clearly than a speech. Lady Vale laughed, lightly, too lightly. "My eldest, yes. She was just seeing to Mrs. Elling. Honora is useful in such situations." Honora felt the word as one feels cold metal in the hand. Useful. It had followed her for years. Useful at home, useful in visiting sick tenants, useful at accounts, useful in every place where labor was wanted and brightness was not. Ashford turned fully toward her at last. "Miss Vale," he said, "have you ever had business with the parish at Briar Hollow?" The question was so unexpected that even Lady Vale lost her composure for a breath, and Honora, looking up into his grave, searching face, answered before caution could stop her. "Who has lived through a hard winter, Your Grace, and had none?" For one suspended moment, the room seemed to listen with him. Honora had not meant the answer to sound pointed. It was simply true, and truth often came out of her in the plainest shape. Yet under the chandeliers, with her mother watching and the musicians already waiting, the words carried a weight she herself had not intended. Ashford's expression altered so slightly that most would have missed it. A stillness settled across his features, but it was no longer the reserve of a man enduring society. It was recognition struggling towards certainty. Lady Vale recovered first. She gave a soft laugh, the kind meant to sweep awkwardness aside before anyone could examine it. "My eldest has a grave turn of mind, Your Grace. She can find hardship in the middle of a dance." Celia smiled because her mother did. Marianne did not. Ashford did not look away from Honora. And yet hardship exists, even in ballrooms. The reply was courteous, but it landed with more force than if he had rebuked Lady Vale openly. A faint color rose in her cheeks. She shifted her fan and tried another direction. "You must forgive her. Miss Vale has spent so much time over accounts and parish errands that she has nearly forgotten what young women are expected to enjoy." Honora felt that familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the one that came whenever her mother turned her into an object lesson before company. She could feel eyes upon her now. Nearby, a gentleman pretending to study the card tables was listening with all his attention. A matron under pink feathers angled her head to catch every word. The room smelled suddenly too warm, too close, all wax and perfume and polished wood. "I have forgotten very little, Mamma," she said quietly. "No?" Lady Vale's smile thinned. "Then perhaps you have chosen." That was sharper. Honora understood it at once. Chosen obscurity. chosen spinsterhood, chosen to waste what had once been set aside for her future. The old accusation stood between them as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. She held her mother's gaze for a breath, then let it go. Public battles with Lady Vale never ended in victory. They ended in scenes, and scenes always stained the daughter more than the parent. Ashford seemed to feel the shift in her. His voice lowered, though those nearest could still hear. "Miss Vale, do you know Briar Hollow well?" She hesitated. The place was not unfamiliar. She knew the smell of damp stone in the little vestry where the ledgers had been kept, the rough grain of the table where she had once sat with cold fingers and a traveling cloak still wet at the hem. She remembered children with hollow cheeks, a mother trying to barter silver buttons for meal, a blacksmith's wife counting jars of broth as if they were treasure. She knew too much. That was the danger. "I know it sufficiently," she said at last. "From visits?" he asked. "From necessity." A murmur stirred at that. Lady Vale's fan snapped shut. "My daughter speaks in riddles this evening," she said. "Your Grace, the musicians are waiting, and I am certain the room expects the opening set to begin." The leader of the orchestra, uncertain whether to resume, lifted his bow and glanced toward the Duke. Ashford did not move. Instead, very deliberately, he drew a folded scrap of paper from inside his coat, looked down at the worn crease in the candlelight, and then raised his eyes to Honora's face. The paper was old enough at the folds to have lost its sharpness. Honora saw that much before she looked away. She knew the kind of scrap it was at once. Cut from a larger page, carried too long in a pocket, the ink faintly bruised where a thumb had pressed over the same lines again and again. A most unreasonable fear passed through her. He knew. Her hands, still bare of any ornament beyond plain gloves, tightened one over the other until the seams pressed into her skin. Lady Vale took a half-step forward. "Your Grace, I am sure whatever business concerns a parish book may be managed at some more suitable hour. The company is waiting." The company was indeed waiting. The first couples had formed already. The gentlemen stood with the particular stiffness of men pretending not to notice a delay. The ladies arranged their skirts and curiosity in equal measure. Near the musicians' platform, the master of ceremonies wore the strained smile of a man whose entire evening threatened to slip its order. A whisper ran along the wall and broke into smaller whispers. Honora felt them touch her shoulders like cold fingers. Ashford unfolded the scrap only enough to glance at the lower edge. "Perhaps," he said, "but I have found that some business refuses to be postponed merely because a room is well lit." Lady Vale's color rose. "I do not understand you." "No," he said, and then his gaze returned to Honora. "Miss Vale may." She understood enough. She remembered a storm-soaked evening in the Briar Hollow vestry when the vicar's ink had clotted in the cold and she had trimmed a torn page with a knife because there had been no whole sheet left fit for writing. She had left instructions with the money that night and signed them, as always, with the same borrowed humility. If he held one of those notes now, then some part of what she had buried had risen straight into the middle of this glittering room. "Your Grace," she said softly, "if you mean to question me, I would rather you did not do so here." And there it was. No denial. Ashford heard it. So did Lady Vale, though she lacked the key to it. "Question you?" her mother repeated. "Honora, what in heaven's name could the Duke have to ask of you?" Mrs. Elling, forgotten on her chair, looked from one face to another in open confusion. Celia had gone pale with irritation at being excluded from a scene she did not understand. Marianne, poor child, seemed on the verge of grasping that her sister had a life none of them had been invited into. The orchestra leader raised his bow once more, appealing silently for permission to begin. Ashford did not grant it. Instead, with a movement so slight that most only noticed it after the fact, he lifted his hand. The violins fell mute. Every murmur in the room dropped away. Candle flames trembled in the mirrors. Honora felt her own breath catch as the hush widened outward, row by row, until even the servants by the doors had stilled. Then the Duke of Ashford, before all assembled, said in a clear, even voice, "Miss Honora Vale, will you do me the honor of standing up with me for the opening set?" No one in the room seemed able to breathe properly after that. The invitation did not merely surprise the assembly, it disordered it. One could feel the disturbance travel outward like a ripple through water. A duke might choose any lady for distinction, and people would murmur, compare, invent motives. But this was different. He had stopped the music itself, and he had chosen the woman most people had already agreed not to see. Lady Vale stared at him as if she had misheard. "Your Grace?" she said, every syllable bright with strain. "There must be some mistake. The set is already formed. Miss Celia was just preparing to—" "I addressed Miss Honora Vale," he replied. Celia's face flamed crimson. Marianne looked from one to the other with open distress. Mrs. Elling, still seated, had gone so still that her glass of ratafia trembled in her hand. Near the wall, two young men exchanged a glance of delighted scandal. The master of ceremonies lowered his clipboard and pretended not to listen, while listening with all his might. Honora felt the heat rise to her own cheeks, though not from vanity. Her first thought was that he must mean to oblige her out of some grave courtesy. Her second was worse, that he meant to expose her, here, before all these people, with no warning and no mercy. She looked at the folded note still in his hand, and something cold moved down her spine. "Your Grace," she said, very low, "I believe you are mistaken in me." His eyes did not leave hers. "Do you?" Such a simple question, and impossible to answer honestly. Lady Vale tried once more. "Honora does not often lead a set. She is unused to—" "Mama?" Honora said softly. That single word held more plea than protest. She could bear her mother's scorn. She had borne it for years. What she could not endure, not in that minute, was to be handled like a parcel passed between stronger wills. The room seemed close around her. Candlelight struck the mirrors too harshly. Powder and perfume thickened the air. Beyond the windows the dark looked almost kind. Ashford spoke again, and this time his voice lowered just enough that only those nearest could hear. "I do not ask from charity, Miss Vale." That made her look up. Whatever else he was not a man given to idle dramatics. There was nothing playful in his face, nothing patronizing, nothing meant to amuse the room. She saw gravity there, and something rarer, something that unsettled her more deeply than mockery could have done. Respect. As if he stood before an equal whose consent mattered. "For the love of heaven, Honora," Lady Vale whispered through her smile, "do not stand there and force his Grace to repeat himself." Force, as though every humiliation of her life had consisted in making other people uncomfortable by existing. The old instinct rose in her at once. Withdraw, apologize, make the scene smaller. Yet another instinct, older and quieter, answered it. The instinct that had carried her through churchyards in sleet, across cramped cottages that smelled of broth and damp wool, into rooms where no one had cared whether her gown was graceful so long as her hands were useful. Those people had not frightened her. Why should this room? She drew one breath, then another. "If you are very sure of your invitation, sir," she said, "I will not refuse it." A hush somehow deepened. Ashford bowed. I am entirely sure. He offered his hand. And as Honora placed her gloved fingers on his arm and let him lead her toward the head of the room, she heard behind her the faint, breaking sound of her mother's fans snapping shut. The length of the room never seemed so long to her before. Every step to the top of the set was measured, visible, and impossible to undo. Honora could feel the polished floor through the thin soles of her slippers. Candlelight slid over the boards in trembling gold bands, broken by the shadows of waiting couples. Somewhere behind her, a lady whispered too loudly, "Miss Vale?" And someone else answered with the delighted breathlessness that belongs only to scandal and astonishment. Ashford's arm beneath her hand was steady. He neither hurried her nor slowed to make a show of patience. He simply walked as if her place beside him were the most natural arrangement in the county. It did not feel natural to Honora. It felt perilous. It felt absurd. It felt as if every year of being quietly set aside had gathered itself into this one exposed passage beneath 100 watching eyes. She saw Celia's stricken face, Marianne's bewilderment, her mother standing very straight with color burning high in her cheeks. The caller had retreated by a single pace, which in such a man was near enough to surrender. Even the musicians, bows poised and motionless, watched the pair as though the next note belonged to them alone. When they reached their places, Ashford turned toward her with grave courtesy. "Thank you." "For what, sir?" Her voice was very low. "For trusting you enough to be publicly mistaken?" A faint change touched his mouth, not amusement exactly, but recognition. "I have no wish to mistake you." That answer did nothing to settle her pulse. The couples opposite were trying with all their might to appear occupied in their own concerns. None succeeded. Mr. Talbot, who was to stand nearest the Duke in the second figure, kept adjusting his cuffs. His wife stared fixedly at the row of candles between the mirrors. From the far end of the room came the dry rustle of fans opening and closing like nervous wings. Honora knew that if she lifted her eyes fully, she would meet the whole county assembly staring back at her, curiosity, envy, confusion, and calculation. She kept them on Ashford instead. "You are placing me in a cruel position," she said after a moment. "If this is some error, I shall be ridiculous before the set is done." "It is no error." "You cannot know that." "I know more than you suppose." Those words landed with quiet force. Honora's throat tightened. She wished suddenly, fiercely, that they were anywhere but here. In a vestry, a carriage, even a cold church porch, any place where people did not lean toward them from every side, waiting to feed upon whatever came next. The Duke glanced once toward the orchestra, then back to her. "Tell me one thing," he said. The familiarity of the request startled her more than the command of it. "If I can?" "In Briar Hollow, when the first grain was sent, why was the breeding stock to be kept alive at all hazard?" She looked at him then, fully and without defense. No one outside that winter's work would have asked that question. Gentlemen who wished to be praised for benevolence spoke of relief in broad, glowing terms. They did not remember the precise, ugly choices hunger forced on poor households. They did not ask why a ewe mattered in February more than a child's supper for one night. But Honora remembered. God help her, she remembered everything. "Because if they slaughtered the last milk goat or ewe," she answered before she could stop herself, "they would buy 1 week and lose the whole spring." Ashford drew a slow breath, and without taking his eyes from hers, he said, "Then I have found you." If he had spoken those words in a library or a church porch, they would have struck her deeply enough. Spoken there, before the room with an entire county leaning toward them, they seemed to pass through her like a blade of winter air. Honora's first instinct was denial. Her second was silence. Silence had protected her for years. Silence had kept gratitude from becoming display, had kept need from being paraded, had kept her mother from learning too soon where the godmother's legacy had gone. But silence, she understood in that instant, was about to fail her. "You must not say such things here," she whispered. Ashford heard the fear beneath the words. "Would you have me say nothing at all?" "I would have you begin the dance." A lesser man might have smiled at that. He did not. He looked at her with grave attention, as if her distress mattered more than the room's impatience. That alone unsettled her further. People had long valued her usefulness, her discretion, her readiness. Very few had ever paused over what might wound her. At the edge of the set, Lady Vale could bear the uncertainty no longer. She moved forward a pace. "Your Grace, this grows singular. If Miss Vale has somehow given you the impression of acquaintance in parish matters, I assure you she has no authority in such concerns." The sentence was beautifully shaped and thoroughly cruel. No authority. Honora felt it land, and so, judging by the slight hardening in his face, did Ashford. He turned just enough for his voice to carry beyond the front rank of listeners. "I did not speak of authority, Lady Vale. I spoke of service." That word passed across the room like a lit match near dry straw. Gentlemen lifted their heads, ladies stilled their fans. Even those too far away to catch each phrase sensed a meaning forming and began to press closer with their eyes. The assembly no longer felt like an evening amusement. It felt like a court, though no one had intended it. Honora's pulse beat at her throat. "Please," she said, and this time there was no formality in it. "If you know anything, do not make a spectacle of people who never sought one." His gaze sharpened. "You mean the families at Briar Hollow?" She closed her eyes for half a breath. There was no retreat left in that answer. Ashford lifted the worn note between two fingers, careful with it as though it were something breakable and sacred both. "For a year," he said, more quietly now, "I have been searching for the hand that wrote this." Lady Vale gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "A note? Surely this can be settled tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he said, "would be discourteous to the woman who kept my people alive last winter." This time the words reached everyone near enough to matter. A distinct murmur moved across the room. Mrs. Elling gasped aloud. Celia's confusion gave way to indignation. She thought, as many did at first, that some dreadful misunderstanding had elevated the wrong sister. Marianne looked at Honora with dawning alarm, as if she had suddenly discovered a locked chamber in a familiar house and heard sound behind the door. Honora stood very still. She could hear the blood in her ears, the crackle of candle wicks, the restless scrape of a shoe against the floorboards. She had lived through hunger, cold, and the Moraine winter without trembling so much as she trembled now. Ashford unfolded the page completely. Then he looked out over the room, and in the hush before he spoke again, Honora knew he was about to read every word aloud. The crackle of the candle seemed loud enough to be counted. Ashford did not raise his voice. He had no need. Silence had already arranged the room in his favor. Holding the paper with care, he read first the practical lines, as if he understood that truth often enters more surely through plain words than through ornament. Settle the apothecary first. Children with fever cannot wait upon quarter day. Keep back seed grain, though the temptation to grind it be severe. Any family that parts with its last ewe buys only a week's relief and loses the year. He paused. No one stirred. Even those who could not catch every syllable heard enough to know this was no flirtation, no whimsical distinction offered to a neglected woman out of noble pity. It was an account of hunger, of thought, of decisions made where comfort had no part. Honora stood as if carved from the same stillness that held him, but inwardly she was all motion. She remembered the smell of damp wool and stale smoke in the vestry, the vicar's chapped fingers, the ache in her hand after hours of figures written by poor light. She had meant those instructions for men carrying sacks in mud, not for ladies wearing pearls. Then Ashford read the signature. "Enter the funds as given by a debtor of the parish." The words seemed to fall through the assembly one by one. Mrs. Elling covered her mouth. A gentleman near the back whispered, "Good God!" Celia stared as though the language itself had turned strange. Marianne's eyes had filled, though she did not yet understand why. And Lady Vale? Lady Vale had gone perfectly white beneath her powder. Honora could not bear the gaze of the room any longer. She looked instead at the paper. Yes, it was hers. That cramped downward stroke in debtor where the quill had caught. That blunt tail on parish because the ink had thinned. He had carried it for a year. The knowledge struck her with a force stranger than exposure itself. Lady Vale found her voice in a rush. "This proves nothing. Anyone might have written." "No," said Ashford. He lowered the note and turned slightly, enough that the nearest ranks and then those beyond could see his face. Anyone might sign modestly. Very few understand the difference between relief and ruin. Very few send medicine before being asked twice. Very few know that a parish ledger must protect the pride of the hungry if it is to protect anything worth saving. There was no heat in his manner, but there was conviction. Conviction is often more terrible in a drawing room than anger. Lady Vale laughed then, too brightly, too quickly. "You cannot possibly suppose that my daughter, my eldest, has been wandering the county in matters of grain and livestock." Honora shut her eyes briefly. Here it was, the true fear. Not that people might think her charitable, but that they might discover she had acted outside the narrow uses assigned to her. Ashford looked at Honora before he answered. "I do not suppose, Lady Vale. I know she was involved. What I do not yet know is whether she will permit me to say more." The whole room turned back to her. Her throat felt tight. If she denied it now, she might still bury half the truth. If she admitted it, she would drag into the light not only herself, but every secret sale, every coin quietly parted with, every choice her mother would call madness. Ashford waited. He would not force the final step. Of that, at least, she was suddenly sure. And from somewhere behind the lines of listeners, a new voice spoke into the hush. "I should like to hear Miss Vale answer." The voice came from the third row of onlookers, dry with age and entirely unafraid. Heads turned. The speaker was Mr. Pritchard, the vicar from Briar Hollow, a spare man with silver hair brushed flat to his skull and a black coat gone shiny at the cuffs. He had not been much noticed earlier in the evening. Country clergy rarely were, unless they gave offense or blessings. Now the little clergyman stepped forward through a parting in the crowd, one hand closed around the head of his walking stick, his lined face lifted at the head of the set. "If Miss Vale will forgive me," he said, bowing first to Honora and then to the Duke, "I should like to hear her answer, because I believe I know that hand myself." A tremor went through Honora so sudden that she had to lock her knees to remain steady. Of all the people who might have appeared at such a moment, she had not expected him. She remembered him too well in other weather, collar turned up against sleet, nose reddened by cold, spectacles clouded from damp as he bent over the parish book with her. He had kept her confidence because she asked it of him for the sake of others. If he spoke now, that whole quiet labor would begin to rise around her like flood water. Lady Vale looked from the vicar to her daughter and back again, and for the first time genuine alarm stripped elegance from her expression. "Mr. Pritchard, this is absurd. You cannot mean to involve my family in some village confusion." The vicar did not even glance at her. "My lady, I mean only to tell the truth if truth is required." That simple sentence shook the room more than any grand declaration could have done. Truth. People always claim to want it, until it chooses an inconvenient doorway. Honora saw several ladies lower their eyes. A magistrate near the back straightened where he stood. Celia had begun to look frightened now, rather than merely offended. Marianne, poor Marianne, was staring at her sister with the bewildered ache of a child who finds a map hidden inside a familiar book. Ashford inclined his head to the clergyman. "Then you recognize the writing?" "I recognize the manner before the letters," Mr. Pritchard replied. "The writer always thought first of what would spare the poor their shame. That is rarer than money, your grace." The words struck Honora harder than praise ought to have done. She had not imagined anyone noticed the difference. To her it had seemed obvious. Bread given with humiliation soured in the mouth. Aid entered loudly in the ledger became gossip before it became comfort. If the families at Briar Hollow had endured that winter with any fragment of dignity left to them, it mattered. Lady Vale let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "This is becoming theatrical. Honora, speak at once and end it. Tell His Grace and Mr. Pritchard that they have both made a monstrous error." There it was again, the command to smooth over, to protect appearances, to make herself useful by becoming small. For years she had obeyed it without argument because resistance cost too much. Tonight, with the whole county watching, she felt the old habit pull at her like a hand at her sleeve. Mr. Pritchard looked at her over the heads of the crowd, and his faded eyes were kind. "Miss Vale," he said softly, though everyone heard, "shall I tell them who sat with me in the vestry when the snow came through the south window, and the children had no broth left at all?" The kindness in the old vicar's voice nearly undid her more than any accusation could have done. Honora had held herself upright through sharper things than this. She had endured her mother's measured disdain, the county's easy dismissal, the startled gaze of a ballroom turning all at once toward her. But tenderness was harder. It pressed upon the very place where one had hidden the wound. For one dangerous instant she thought she might weep, and that humiliation she would not allow. She lifted her chin instead. "No, Mr. Pritchard," she said. Her voice came steadier than she felt. "You shall not be required to tell it for me." A stir passed through the room, softer than the earlier shock, yet somehow deeper. People always expect confession to sound dramatic. They do not know how quiet truth may be when it has long been borne alone. Honora looked first at the vicar, then at Ashford, and only after that at the faces beyond them, though she did not let her gaze rest on her mother. "I did sit in that vestry," she said, "more than once." Lady Vale made a sharp, incredulous sound. "Honora?" Her daughter did not stop. She had spent too many years stopping for everyone else. There were families at Briar Hollow with no strength left for pride except the little that remained in keeping their troubles from becoming entertainment. If help was to be given, it ought to be given with as much privacy as could be managed. The ledger needed an entry. I would not put my own name to it. Every ear in the room was bent toward her now. The air seemed close with beeswax and attention. A lady in green near the back lowered her fan very slowly, as though afraid the rustle might interrupt. Ashford did not move. He stood beside her with the folded note in hand, listening as if each word mattered. Honora drew a careful breath. As for the money, yes, it was mine to dispose of. This time the murmur was unmistakable. Celia stared at her in pure disbelief. Marianne had gone white. Lady Vale's expression changed with startling speed, outrage first, then dawning calculation, then something uglier. Fear. Not fear for her daughter, but fear of what the county might think of a household that had mocked a woman while living under the same roof as such conduct. "You absurd girl," Lady Vale said, too low for the far edges of the room, but sharp enough for those nearest. "Do you mean to boast of impoverishing yourself before all these people?" Honora turned at last and met her mother's eyes. "I mean only to answer what has been asked." By throwing away your future? The words struck the center of the silence. There it was in plain form at last, the charge that had shadowed every unkindness. That a woman's first duty was to preserve her market value, her comfort, her prospects, and that anything spent on mercy was wasted. A flush rose in Honora's face, though not from shame. "If grain is locked in a chest while children hunger," she said, "it ceases to be provision. It becomes vanity." Somewhere to the left, a man exhaled under his breath as if the remark had hit him squarely. Mr. Pritchard closed his eyes for a moment, perhaps in relief. Ashford's gaze sharpened with something that looked very much like admiration. Lady Vale gave a brittle laugh that fooled no one. "You speak prettily now, but you were foolish then. That money was your dowry." Honora's fingers tightened once against the folds of her skirt. "Yes," she said, "it was." And then, before anyone else could seize the moment or soften it or turn it aside, she added the one truth her mother had never once imagined hearing in public. "And I sold every last portion of it myself." For a heartbeat after she said it, no one there seemed able to move. The confession had been too plain to be mistaken, too costly to be dismissed as ornament. Honora felt the silence strike outward from her in widening rings. It touched the card tables, the windows silvered with night, the ladies standing shoulder to shoulder beneath plumes and jewels, the gentlemen who had spent years discussing farms and rents as abstractions, while never once imagining that the quiet, unmarried daughter of Lady Vale had sold her own future for seed and medicine. The air smelled of hot wax and crushed orange leaf, and somewhere a candle gave a tiny spit, as if even flame had found the pause unbearable. Lady Vale found speech first, though it came thin with outrage. "You will not stand there and make a virtue of disobedience." Honora turned her head slowly toward her mother. The movement felt strange, as if it belonged to a different woman than the one who had entered the county assembly prepared to endure another evening of managed embarrassment. "It was not disobedience, Mamma. What else shall I call it? Secret dealings, disposed property, clandestine visits to cottages and vestries?" Lady Vale's fan trembled in her grip. "You were left a provision for marriage, for security, for your own establishment." "And there were children with no broth," Honora said. She did not raise her voice, yet the words traveled with shocking clarity. A small sound escaped Marianne, half sob, half breath. Celia looked as if the floor itself had betrayed her. She had been taught, as they all had, that a dowry was weight, safety, consequence. To hear her sister speak of it as though it might be outweighed by a child's supper unsettled more than family vanity. It disturbed the order by which they had all been taught to live. Ashford watched the exchange without interruption, but his stillness had changed again. He was no longer merely certain of what Honora had done. He was witnessing the cost of it in the very house of her own blood. Mr. Pritchard struck the floor once with his stick. The tap was small, but it steadied the room. "Her money bought corn when the roads were nearly shut," he said, "and later seed when wiser heads were saying there was no use planting a field that hunger would strip by March. She was wiser than they." Lady Vale rounded on him. "You had no right to encourage such madness." "It was not madness, my lady. It was mercy with arithmetic." That line stayed in the air. Several gentlemen lowered their eyes. One of them, Sir Edwin Mercer, a magistrate who prided himself on sensible parish management, cleared his throat as if to say something, and then thought better of it. He remembered too well the petition from Briar Hollow he had delayed because the sums seemed inconvenient. Others remembered things too. One widow recalled a parcel of dried herbs sent without name. Another man remembered being asked through an intermediary whether a cart could travel the East Road after rain. These scraps of memory began to stir around the room like leaves caught in a current. Ashford folded the note once more, carefully. Miss Vale, he said, and now his voice held no public distance at all. When you sold that legacy, did you intend anyone to know? Honora looked at him. Whatever came next would shape the room. No, she said. I intended people to eat. A murmur rose again, deeper this time. And then, from near the doors, a woman in a faded plum gown stepped forward, clutching her gloves in both hands, and said in a shaking voice, If this is indeed Miss Vale, then I owe her my little boy's life. The woman in the faded plum gown had plainly not meant to speak in such a room. Her voice shook with it. She stood just inside the ring of listeners, bonnet ribbons slightly crushed where they had pressed beneath her cloak, cheeks flushed from either heat or nerves. Honora knew her after a moment. Mrs. Fenner, a cottager's daughter born at Briar Hollow, later married to a wheelwright in the next parish, respectable enough now to be invited to large assemblies by a prosperous aunt, though not secure enough to feel at ease in them. Her gloves were worn at the thumbs. She looked as if she regretted her courage and could not withdraw it. My little Thomas, she said, twisting the kid leather in her hands. He had the fever after Christmas. We had sold near everything we could spare, and my husband was away trying for work on the canal roads. Mr. Pritchard sent broth and powders and a packet of willow bark besides. I asked who paid for it, and he said only that I was to thank God and keep the child warm. Her eyes fixed on Honora's face. Later there was flour, then 2 blankets. I know I was not the only one, but my boy is alive. No one interrupted her. In grand rooms, people like Mrs. Fenner are usually spoken over or smiled aside, or gently corrected until their truths become smaller. Tonight, perhaps because a duke had already torn the evening open, the room let her finish. The silence afterward was different from the first silence. It no longer belonged to curiosity. It belonged to conscience. Lady Vale gave a brittle little sound. This is intolerable. We are turning a public assembly into a parish grievance meeting. A Thanksgiving would be nearer the mark, said Mr. Pritchard. The line was so dry that a few startled breaths almost became laughter, though no one dared quite release it. Ashford's expression did not change, but something warmer entered his eyes when they returned to Honora. A grave kind of esteem that seemed to ask nothing and yet altered everything. Honora felt that gaze and almost wished he would look elsewhere. She had hidden these acts because she could bear hunger more easily than notice. Now gratitude stood before her in a crowded ballroom, wearing a faded plum gown and speaking her son's name aloud. She had no shield against that. Mrs. Fenner went on, emboldened by necessity. And in the spring, she said, when folks were desperate enough to grind the seed, there came word through the vicar that if we planted, there'd be help to carry us until the first shoots took. My husband said only someone who knew what an empty yard means in March would have thought of that. Celia lowered herself abruptly onto a chair, as if her legs had given way. Marianne turned to look at her sister with wet, astonished eyes, no longer confused but wounded by her own ignorance. She had shared a roof with Honora, shared breakfast trays and church pews and family calls, and known nothing. Lady Vale saw it too, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest exposure of all. Ashford folded the note and slipped it back into his coat. Then, before the assembly could scatter the truth into whispers and private versions, he asked in that calm, carrying voice, Mrs. Fenner, were the relief entries all signed the same way? The woman nodded at once, and Honora knew, before another word was spoken, that he meant to bind her secret to testimony no one in the room would dare deny. He had the room now, and everyone knew it. Ashford did not use that advantage crudely. That was one of the first things Honora noticed, even through the pounding in her temples. Another man might have pressed the moment until it cracked, turning gratitude into spectacle and revelation into triumph. He did neither. He simply looked from Mrs. Fenner to the cluster of county families nearest the top of the room, then back to the woman beside him, as if making plain that the truth would be handled with care, but handled still. "Yes," Mrs. Fenner said, answering his question at last. "Always the same. The vicar read it once when I begged to know who had helped us. He would not tell me the name, only the words, 'A debtor of the parish.'" At the phrase, several people stirred visibly. A magistrate's wife near the mirrors whispered it under her breath, as if tasting something she had heard in rumor months ago. Sir Edwin Mercer frowned in recollection. He had indeed seen an entry bearing those words in one of the relief summaries passed to him, and thought it some clergyman's pious flourish. Now his face reddened. Lady Vale recovered enough to seize at the most worldly argument available. "If my daughter chose to be reckless," she said, "that is hardly proof of wisdom. Charity unguided by prudence helps no one for long." Honora heard the old doctrine in those words and felt, unexpectedly, no fear of it at all. Perhaps because the room had already seen too much. Perhaps because secrecy, once broken, leaves an odd kind of freedom in its wake. Ashford answered first. "It was prudence that saved them," he said quietly. "Prudence enough to buy seed before the roads failed. Prudence enough to preserve stock rather than consume it. Prudence enough to settle accounts without humiliating the recipients. What you call recklessness, Lady Vale, kept Briar Hollow from becoming a burial list." No one could pretend now that this was mere gallantry. The words fell with grave precision. Honora saw several heads bow, not to him, but to the rebuke itself. Celia looked as though she wanted desperately to flee. Marianne's face, poor child, had softened into something like shame. Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat. "There is more, if it must be said. The apothecary's widow in Market Cross is present this evening with her brother's family. Mrs. Bell remembers the payments. And Thomas Reed, the miller's son, has on him still one of Miss Vale's sealed receipts, because she would never trust a sum unrecorded." Lady Vale turned in disbelief. Half the county was apparently in league with her. "Not in league," said the vicar. "In confidence." That distinction struck home. Confidence. Not romance, not conspiracy, not foolish female sentiment. Quiet competence. Honora stood in the center of it, feeling strangely apart from herself, as if she watched another woman bear this unveiling with a composure she herself could scarcely feel. Yet she remained steady. Ashford's presence beside her did not diminish that steadiness. It seemed only to hold the room back while she kept it. Then a movement near the back drew every eye. A stout woman in dove-gray silk, cheeks flushed with agitation, stepped forward from beside her brother. Honora recognized Mrs. Bell at once from the shop on Market Cross, where jars of camphor and dried foxglove lined the shelves, and winter medicines smelled bitter in the air. The apothecary's widow clutched a small leather account book to her breast. "I do remember," she said, "and if anyone doubts it, I still have her hand in my ledger." Mrs. Bell's little ledger looked absurdly small to hold so much weight. She came forward clutching it in both hands, the worn leather darkened where fingers had pressed over it for years. Honora knew that book as surely as she knew the smell of camphor that always clung to the apothecary's shop. She remembered standing at that counter in winter dusk, cold seeping through her boots, asking in the plainest voice for fever powders, willow bark, lamp oil, and the cheap wool wrappings that kept heat in a child's chest. Mrs. Bell had not asked useless questions then. She asked none now. "If I may, Your Grace," the widow said. Ashford stepped aside at once. That, too, the room noticed. A duke yielding space to an apothecary's widow would have been remarkable on any other evening. Tonight it felt only proper. Mrs. Bell opened the ledger with careful hands, turning past pages of ordinary accounts, penny drafts, salves, cordial waters, strips of lint, until she reached a page marked by a frayed ribbon. "There," she said, touching the line with one finger. "Medicine supplied to Briar Hollow by private instruction. Payment received in full." And beneath it, her voice faltered, not from uncertainty but from feeling. She swallowed and read, "Enter the charge without naming the sick. What is misery for one night need not become gossip for a year. Signed, a debtor of the parish." The words passed through the assembly with a force none could now resist. They were too particular, too practical, too unmistakably of a piece with the note Ashford had read aloud. A few ladies lowered their eyes in open shame. Men who prided themselves on estate management stared at Honora as though seeing, with painful suddenness, that while they had debated principles over claret, she had been solving actual hunger with ink, judgment, and sacrifice. Lady Vale swayed a little, then caught herself. "You all speak as if this were admirable beyond measure," she said, and there was desperation in her now, stripped of silk and breeding. "But what was it in truth? A woman throwing away her settlement for strangers, a daughter acting in secrecy, a future squandered upon cottagers who were never her responsibility." Honora heard the hiss beneath the elegance. She heard, too, the sharp intake of breath from Marianne, who had perhaps never before understood that cruelty may sound most polished when it believes itself reasonable. Ashford's face turned cold. Before he could speak, Honora did. "They were my responsibility because I knew," she said. "I knew what was needed, and I had the means to answer for a time. That is responsibility enough." The simplicity of it struck harder than any flourish. Even Lady Vale fell silent. Knowledge, means, action. There was no ornament to attack there. Mr. Pritchard bowed his head as if to a truth properly spoken. Mrs. Fenner was crying openly now, trying not to. Celia kept staring at her sister in something like disbelief, as though the quiet woman she had lived beside had suddenly acquired height, force, and history before her eyes. Ashford looked at Honora for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried to the far edges of the room. "Then let the county understand what it is witnessing." And with that, he turned from her to the assembled company as if he meant, at last, to name her fully before them all. The room seemed to draw itself upright for judgment. Ashford did not thunder. He had nothing of the stage player in him. Yet when he turned toward the assembled company, the hush sharpened as surely as if a bell had been struck. Candlelight caught the planes of his face, the white edge of his cravat, the dark line of his coat. Honora, beside him, felt the strange unreality of standing still while the world she had known shifted under her feet. "You have heard enough," he said, "to know that this is no misunderstanding, no sentiment exaggerated by gratitude, and no whim of mine. Miss Vale's money, her judgment, and her concealment of her own part carried Briar Hollow through a season when my tenants might very easily have been lost." That word, lost, settled heavily. People who had never seen a hungry child knew at least what it meant to hear a village discussed in such terms by its own landlord. Several gentlemen straightened with discomfort. They had all known the winter had been hard. Very few had imagined how narrow the margin truly was. Lady Vale opened her mouth, but Ashford's glance stopped her from speaking. It was not rude. It was final. "She asked no recognition," he went on. "She entered her name nowhere. She guarded the dignity of those she helped more carefully than most guard their own reputation. And tonight, in this room, I have had the singular misfortune of hearing that same woman spoken of as a warning." No one looked at Lady Vale then, which was in some ways worse than if they had all stared. Social cruelty is often most devastating when delivered by collective avoidance. Celia had covered her face with her fan. Mary Ann stood bare-eyed and stricken, not with vanity wounded, but with the first painful knowledge that she had joined in a wrong she had never examined. Honora's cheeks burned. She had never wanted a public champion. She had wanted obscurity, usefulness, and enough quiet to go on. Yet as he spoke, she felt something inside her uncurl, something long pressed flat by habit. To be named rightly, it was almost unbearable. Mr. Pritchard bowed his head. Mrs. Bell clutched her ledger. Mrs. Fenner cried openly now, too moved to care who saw. Around the room, pieces of memory began fastening themselves together in other minds. A cart hired in secret, a bill settled without dispute, a packet sent through bad roads, a name withheld. The shape of the thing was complete at last. Ashford turned then, not to the assembly, but back to Honora herself. His voice lowered, though the nearest still heard it. "I have sought the anonymous benefactress for a year," he said. "I did not expect to find her standing in a ballroom, being diminished by those who ought to have honored her first." The words struck deep because they were not decorative. They were plain, grave, and true. Lady Vale could bear no more. "This is monstrous," she said, and now all polish had cracked. "A private family matter dragged into display." "No, Mamma," Honora said. She had not meant to interrupt. The words simply came. Every face turned back to her. Even Ashford fell silent. She felt the full weight of the room, and for once did not shrink from it. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her heart was not, but that was another matter. "It ceased to be private," she said, "the moment hunger entered those cottages." And then, before anyone could answer, the master of ceremonies, white-faced and forgotten for half an hour, stepped forward and asked in a shaken voice whether His Grace still wished the set to begin, or something else entirely. The poor man's question hung in the air like a plea for ordinary rules to return. For a moment, Honora almost pitied him. He had come dressed for order, with his neat lists and polished shoes, and the solemn authority of a man who believed an evening might be managed by sequence, precedent, and proper bows. Instead, he had found himself standing in the middle of a reckoning. Candle wax had run low in 2 of the wall sconces. The violins waited in a silence that felt louder than music. Half the room leaned toward the head of the set. The other half pretended dignity and failed. Ashford turned his head toward the man. "The set will begin," he said, "but it will begin with the truth understood." Then he looked back at the assembly and spoke with a calm that made every syllable land. "Miss Honora Vale supplied grain, seed, medicines, and private relief to Briar Hollow during the famine winter. She did so at personal cost. She did so without seeking credit. She did so with more foresight than those who had actual charge of the place." His gaze moved, briefly and deliberately, across the magistrates, the neighboring landowners, the mothers who had trained daughters to smile at rank and dismiss usefulness. "I ask that no one here mistake what that means." No one could now. There are moments, if you have ever stood in a crowded room and felt an opinion turn, when you can sense the change before anyone speaks. It is in the posture, in the lowered eyes, in the sudden hunger to have been on the right side all along. Honora felt it pass across the room with a kind of terrible clarity. The same people who had overlooked her half an hour earlier now looked at her as if she were made of something rarer than beauty. Lady Vale knew it too. Her face had become composed again, but it was the composition of a woman gripping the edge of a cliff. "This has gone far enough," she said. "Honora, come away at once." It was a mother's command, practiced over years. Once, Honora would have obeyed from reflex, not agreement. She would have stepped back, apologized for causing disorder, and let herself be hidden behind family dignity. The old habit rose, and then, for the first time in her life, found no purchase. "No, Mama," she said. The words were quiet. They fell into the room with more force than any defiance she might have shouted. Celia made a small sound of disbelief. Marianne closed her eyes briefly, as if in pain and relief together. Mr. Pritchard bowed his head. Mrs. Bell pressed the ledger tighter to her breast. Even Mrs. Fenner stood a little straighter, watching the woman who had helped her child now refuse, at last, to be arranged like furniture. Ashford extended his arm once more. There was nothing theatrical in the gesture. It was simply offered, publicly, plainly, before all who had seen her slighted. "Miss Vale," he said, "if you are willing, let the evening proceed as it ought to have done from the first." Honora looked at that offered arm, then at the waiting musicians, the drawn faces of her sisters, the rigid line of her mother's mouth, the sea of witnesses beyond. Her heart beat hard enough to hurt. Then, with a steadiness born of exhaustion and something new beneath it, she placed her hand on his sleeve. And at the first lift of the violin bows, Lady Vale said sharply from behind them both, "If she means to play the saint tonight, then let the county hear what became of the rest of her inheritance." The first thin cry of the violin died almost as soon as it began. Lady Vale had pitched her voice with cruel skill. Not loud enough to seem vulgar, not soft enough to be mistaken. Everyone heard her. Everyone understood at once that she was striking where she believed her daughter weakest. If they had begun to raise Honora up, Lady Vale would drag into view some hidden defect, some compromising remainder, some stain upon the shining picture now forming around her. Honora's hand tightened on Ashford's sleeve. He felt it. She knew he did, because the muscles of his arm shifted once beneath the cloth, then steadied. But he did not turn toward her as if she required shielding. He simply remained where he was, letting her choose whether this fresh blow should be met or ignored. It was a strange gift, that refusal to seize her voice for her. She had almost never been offered it. Lady Vale came forward one step, color bright in her face now. "Since we are airing family accounts before the whole county," she said, "perhaps it should be known that my eldest did not act out of pure generosity alone. She stripped herself of every protection proper to a woman and left nothing behind. Not prudence, not obedience, not even honesty with her own household." The words produced exactly what Lady Vale intended, uncertainty. Not in the central fact, for that could not now be undone, but in its framing. A few listeners shifted. Some looked at Honora with pity again, others with that avid interest society feels when virtue and irregularity can be made to sit side by side. It was one thing to be noble, quite another to be noble inconveniently. Honora felt the old shame rise almost by memory, as if years of apology had awakened and reached for her throat. She knew what her mother meant. After the last portion of the legacy had gone, when medicines still had to be paid for and seed still had to be secured, she had parted with the one thing Lady Vale considered untouchable, the pearls left by her godmother, meant for her wedding day. They had been sold quietly through a jeweler 2 counties over. The matter had been concealed at home by saying the case had been misplaced in a move between seasons. Lady Vale had never believed that explanation, but neither had she known the truth. Until now. Marianne gave a little gasp. Celia looked quickly at her mother, then at Honora, and seemed suddenly younger than she was. To them, the pearls had always been part of a story about the future, the sort of heirloom that secured imagination, if not happiness. To spend them on fever powders and seed grain was beyond recklessness. It sounded like renunciation. Lady Vale saw the shock in their faces and pressed harder. "Yes," she said, "even the jewels meant to mark her marriage. Gone. Traded away in secret like contraband. That is the woman you are all prepared to worship tonight." No one answered at once. Ashford's face had gone very still. Mr. Pritchard shut his eyes briefly, as if he had guessed but hoped never to hear it spoken in such a manner. Mrs. Bell looked as though she might weep anew. And Honora? Honora felt something inside her settle. There comes a point, sometimes, when humiliation overshoots its mark, when the thing most dreaded is dragged so fully into the light that fear loses its hold. She turned from the musicians, from the waiting set, from the whole glittering room, and faced her mother at last. "Yes," she said, "the pearls as well." Then she drew breath to tell them why. Once the words were spoken aloud, they no longer had power to shame her. That was the strange mercy of the moment. The pearls had glittered for years in Lady Vale's imagination, more brightly than they ever had in their case. They were meant for a wedding breakfast no one now expected, for a future arranged around appearances, for the solemn pleasure of seeing an eldest daughter at last become useful in the approved way. To hear that they had gone for broth, bark, and seed ought, by all her mother's laws, to have ruined Honora entirely. Instead, the ruin failed to arrive. "I sold them in March," she said, facing the room and not merely her mother. The fever had gone through the lower cottages twice. Mrs. Bell had extended credit beyond prudence. A delivery of meal had stalled because the carrier feared he would not be paid. The pearls would not warm a child. They could be sold. So they were. The room absorbed that plain account with a silence far more respectful than any speech of admiration. A few listeners had tears in their eyes. Others looked stricken by the simplicity of it. Grand sacrifice can be romanticized from a distance. Specific sacrifice? That is harder. It smells of damp wool and medicine chests. It empties drawers and leaves jewel cases bare. Lady Vale was breathing quickly now. "You speak as though this were all perfectly natural. It was necessary. And what of your own life?" For years that question had been used as a weapon. Tonight, in the open air of truth, it sounded smaller. Honora heard it and felt no stab from it at all. "My life," she said, "was not the only one in the room." The answer landed so cleanly that several heads turned away at once. Even Sir Edwin Mercer, who had blundered through the winter with magistrate's caution and little imagination, seemed unable to meet her eye. Marianne had begun to cry in earnest. Celia stood pale and silent, her fan hanging forgotten at her side. Ashford spoke then, not loudly, but with the quiet force that had already altered the evening once beyond repair. "Lady Vale, you reproach your daughter for parting with ornaments and expectations. I would suggest that Briar Hollow profited by the exchange." A ripple passed through the crowd. Something finer, sharper. Agreement. Mrs. Bell bowed her head as though in assent. Mr. Pritchard's tired face, lined by bad winters and too many funerals, softened almost to peace. Honora turned slightly toward Ashford, and for one suspended instant the noise, the crowd, the candles, the whole assembled county seemed to recede. He was looking at her as though he had found not merely the answer to a question, but the measure of a person. There was no pity in it, no condescension, only grave respect, and beneath that respect, something warmer beginning to wake. The orchestra still waited. The dancers still stood half-arranged. The room remained held between spectacle and ceremony, between old order and whatever would follow it. Honora knew the next moments would fix how the county remembered this night for years. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat again, very gently this time, as though asking permission to breathe. "Your Grace, Miss Vale." Ashford did not remove his gaze from her face. "The set," he said, "if Miss Vale still consents." Before she could answer, Lady Vale made one final desperate attempt to seize the narrative back. "She may dance if she pleases," her mother said coldly. "But do not let anyone pretend this house has not been made ridiculous by a daughter who preferred cottagers to her own blood." And from somewhere behind Marianne's shoulder came a broken little voice, quiet but unmistakable. "No, Mama," said Marianne. "I think we have been made ridiculous by something else." Marianne's words did what no one else in the room had quite managed. They did not strike with rank or wit or masculine authority. They struck with innocence newly broken. "I think we have been made ridiculous by something else," she had said. And because she was the gentlest of Lady Vale's daughters, because she was not given to defiance, the sentence landed with the weight of an overturned altar. Even Celia looked at her younger sister like she had never heard her voice used that way. Lady Vale went still. For one long breath, she seemed unable to decide whether to rebuke Marianne, command Honora, or retreat behind dignity while some remnant of it could still be saved. That hesitation cost her everything. Society forgives cruelty more readily than loss of command. The room felt it. So did Honora. The violins, uncertain and waiting, lifted once more. Ashford inclined his head to the master of ceremonies. "Now," he said. Music began properly at last. It was the strangest beginning to a dance that any person present was ever likely to witness. No one had forgotten the revelations of the last half hour. None could pretend it had returned to mere entertainment. And yet the first figure moved, because life in such places often reasserts itself through form. Ashford led Honora forward. The polished floor glimmered beneath the candlelight. Silk brushed silk. Shoes whispered across the boards. Behind the measured patterns of the set, the whole county watched the correction of a wrong made visible. Honora had danced before, of course, in younger seasons and duller evenings. Never like this. Never with every gesture transformed by knowledge. When she turned under his hand, she no longer felt like an afterthought brought reluctantly to the floor. She felt the gaze of the room altered around her. Some watched with admiration, some with shame, some with frantic recalculation. Let them. For once their opinions no longer entered her like pins. Ashford danced with exact courtesy, giving her every confidence without crowding her, every steadiness without ostentation. He did not smile often, but there was warmth now in the grave attention he kept fixed upon her. It unsettled her more gently than all the evening's violence. At the end of the first figure he said, low enough for her alone, "Are you equal to this?" She almost laughed, though her throat was tight. "At present I am equal to not falling down, which must serve." A faint light touched his eyes. "It serves admirably." The second figure carried them apart and back together again. Honora became aware, in fragments, of faces passing at the edges of her vision. Mrs. Bell dabbing at her eyes, Mr. Pritchard standing with one hand over the head of his stick, looking tired and content. Mrs. Fenner holding her gloves to her mouth as if to keep herself from sobbing aloud. Celia shaken into silence. Marianne watching with tears still on her cheeks. Lady Vale rigid as carved wood. The room would talk of this night for years. Honora knew that now. Yet the knowledge no longer filled her with dread. Something inside her had shifted too far to be pushed back into the old shape. When the dancers came together once more, Ashford's voice altered. Gratitude was still there, yes, but it was no longer the whole of it. "Miss Vale," he said, "when this set is ended, may I ask leave to call upon you tomorrow?" Her breath caught. "On what business, Your Grace?" His hand closed gently over hers for the next turn of the dance. "On a matter," he said, "that has very little to do with ledgers. and everything to do with you." The dance continued, but nothing in the room was ordinary any longer. Patterns were observed, hands were offered, couples crossed and turned, and all the while the county watched Honora as though some veil had been lifted from a portrait they had passed 100 times without seeing. The music, once meant for amusement, had become a kind of witness. Each figure placed her again and again at the head of the room. None could pretend now that she belonged by the wall, or in the shadow of brighter sisters, or behind a mother's arranged smile. Lady Vale did not leave. That would have been an admission too naked even for her. She remained where she stood, rigid with defeated command, while Marianne kept her distance and Celia stared with the stunned look of a woman who has just discovered that the scale by which she measured life may have been false from the beginning. When the set ended, the applause did not break out all at once. It rose in a strange, uneven wave, as if people had first to decide whether clapping would be vulgar, then realized silence would be worse. Honora felt the sound strike her with almost physical force. She had never been applauded in her life, not at music, not at dancing, not at anything. She stood very still beside Ashford while the last notes faded, and the room, having witnessed its own correction, tried awkwardly to honor it. Ashford bowed over her hand. He did not release it at once. "Miss Vale," he said, in a voice pitched for her alone, "I do not retract my request." She knew at once what he meant. Tomorrow. A call. A matter that concerned her, not Ledger's. Her pulse, which had survived accusation, revelation, and the public ruin of old humiliations, chose that moment to become uncertain. "You choose an odd time to press the point, Your Grace." "It has been an odd evening." That nearly drew a smile from her. Nearly. She had not yet learned how to stand in this new air without caution. "You know very little of me." "I know enough to wish to know more." The answer lingered between them, warm and perilous. Honora looked away first. Across the room, people had begun moving again in earnest. Ladies approached Mrs. Bell and Mr. Pritchard with expressions of earnest sympathy that would have seemed absurd an hour earlier. Gentlemen who had never troubled themselves with village distress were already seeking to speak with Ashford, perhaps to associate themselves belatedly with wisdom. Social weather changes quickly once thunder has broken. And then, through that slow stir of recovery, Lady Vale advanced. She came not as the commanding mother of the evening's beginning, but as a woman driven into a last negotiation by public defeat. Her face had recovered its polish. That made it more dangerous. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying with precise grace, "this night has been surprising. My daughter has plainly been fortunate in attracting your notice. I trust that whatever distinction you mean to show her will be guided by propriety." Honora felt the old instinctive dread at once. There it was again, the attempt to convert what had just happened into social advantage, to speak as though she were an object finally made useful, to place herself back between Honora and her own fate. Ashford's expression cooled, but before he could answer, another figure appeared at Lady Vale's shoulder, older, richly dressed, and familiar to every person in the room. Lady Beving, the Duke's aunt, had arrived late from a neighboring house party. And after taking in the whole extraordinary tableau with one sweeping glance, she said, "I seem to have come at precisely the right moment. Tell me, Marcus, is this the lady you intend to marry?" Lady Beving had the kind of presence that altered a room by stepping into it. She was not young, though age had sharpened rather than diminished her. Black velvet suited her severe carriage. Diamonds flashed at her ears like cold droplets of light. She had the Duke's clear gaze and none of his hesitation. One looked at her and understood at once that she had buried embarrassment long ago and would gladly bury other people's with it. The assembly parted for her instinctively. "Marcus," The use of his Christian name, spoken before half the county, struck almost as sharply as the question itself. Honora felt the air shift again. Lady Vale, who had recovered just enough poise to hope the evening might be salvaged into something advantageous, went almost eagerly still. Celia lifted her head. Marianne closed her hands together as if she scarcely dared breathe. Around them, attention gathered with renewed force. If revelation had transformed the evening once, this threatened to do so again in an altogether different register. Ashford did not answer at once. That pause mattered, not because it suggested reluctance, but because it suggested care. He turned first to his aunt, then to Honora, and only then back to the room that had become unwilling witness to his private intentions. The lamps threw a warm edge across his face, yet there was nothing uncertain in him now. Honora saw it plainly. Whatever had begun for him in gratitude had passed beyond it. "Lady Beving," he said, "your timing is as ruthless as ever." A breath of uneasy laughter moved across the room and broke the tightness by a fraction. His aunt did not smile. "I did not come here for your comfort. I came because my coachman said the entire lane was blocked with carriages and gossip, so I ask again." She looked directly at Honora then, not unkindly, but with a level scrutiny that would have sent most young women into helpless fluster. Honora, having survived far worse in the last hour, met it steadily. "Is this the lady?" Lady Beving repeated. Before Ashford could speak, Lady Vale did. "My lady," she said, gliding into the space with all the grace of desperation refined by habit, "this evening has been most irregular. My daughter has been, I admit, unexpectedly distinguished, but I should not wish any hasty misunderstanding to attach itself to His Grace's generosity." Honora heard the insult hidden under polish. Distinguished, as one might speak of an object suddenly polished well enough for display. Generosity, as if everything that had passed between her and Ashford might still be reduced to patronage. A few hours earlier, such phrasing would have wounded her cleanly. Now it only clarified things. Lady Beving turned that formidable gaze upon Lady Vale. "Generosity," she said. "Is that the word we are using for a woman who kept a village alive while her own family failed to value her?" Lady Vale colored at once. Few things sting the socially ambitious more than being judged by older rank. Fewer still sting more publicly. Ashford stepped forward then, placing himself neither between the women nor ahead of Honora, but exactly beside her. It was a small movement. It felt to Honora larger than the room. "There is no misunderstanding," he said. His tone cut through every whisper. The musicians had gone still again. Even the servants by the doors seemed to listen. Lady Beving inclined her head once, satisfied enough to continue the attack. "Then spare us delay, Marcus. If you mean to speak, speak properly." And Honora, standing with her heart thudding painfully under all that candlelight and witness, realized that the next words out of his mouth might alter not only the evening, but the whole course of her life. The question hung in the room so nakedly that even the candles seemed to lean toward it. Marcus did not blush or laugh it off or hide behind some polished evasion. He looked first at his aunt, then at Honora, and whatever answer he gave was shaped by that order. The whole evening had been a battle over who might speak for her, arrange her, define her. He understood that now. "If Miss Vale were willing to receive me," he said at last, "I should be honored to ask." Lady Beving's sharp face softened by a degree. It was enough to make her almost handsome. "Very good," she said. "That is at least a civilized sentence." A breath of startled amusement ran through the room, loosening the last of the strain. Even Honora felt something in her chest unclench. But Lady Vale, seeing the evening slide beyond any hope of recovery, made one final effort. My daughter has had a singular night, she said tightly. She is in no condition to entertain absurdities born of excitement. Honora turned to her mother. The fear was gone now. In its place was a strange, quiet clarity. No, Mama, she said. I think I am in the best condition I have ever been in to hear the truth. No one spoke after that. Lady Vale's face altered, not into repentance, for she had not that gift, but into the hard stillness of a woman who knows she has lost the room and cannot retrieve it. Celia lowered her eyes. Marianne began to cry again, softly this time, from relief more than shock. Mrs. Bell shut her ledger with both hands pressed over it, as if she were closing something sacred. Honora turned back to Marcus. Yes, she said, and her voice carried further than she intended. You may call tomorrow. The words were simple. They changed everything. He bowed over her hand once more, but this time the gesture was not merely formal. It held gratitude, admiration, and the first unmistakable promise of tenderness. Around them, the assembly, having witnessed humiliation transformed into honor, began at last to breathe like an ordinary gathering again. Conversation rose in careful fragments. The musicians, uncertain no longer, resumed a gentler tune. People moved, though many still glanced toward the front, as if afraid the vision might dissolve if they looked away too long. Lady Beving offered Honora her arm as calmly as if she had always intended it. Come and sit with me for a quarter hour, she said. A woman ought not to be left standing after overturning an entire county. To Honora's astonishment, she almost smiled. Later, when the assembly was thinning and the windows had gone black with midnight, Honora stood for a moment alone near the entrance hall. Servants were bringing in cloaks. The air smelled of wet wool, dying candles, and crushed evergreen underfoot. On a small side table, forgotten amid the evening's tumult, someone had set down a dish of hothouse oranges. One had rolled free and come to rest beside a discarded dance card. She looked at that bright fruit against the scuffed floorboards and thought how strange it was that the things meant only for display had passed untouched all night, while the things that truly sustained life had done their work in silence. Grain, broth, bark, seed, and a hand that had learned at last not to hide itself. Outside, dawn had not yet come, but the frost on the carriage step caught the lantern light like scattered pearls. If this story stayed with you, you're very welcome to subscribe and spend another evening here with us. And if you like, tell me which moment you felt most sharply, the halted music, the ledger, or that one quiet yes.